The plate sat between them on the scratched formica table, half a grilled cheese sandwich and a scoop of coleslaw dividing itself in two without anyone asking it to. And Ryan Mitchell slid the smaller half toward the woman across from him before he'd even finished thinking about it, the way a man does something out of habit rather than decision. She hadn't touched her water in 10 minutes. She hadn't looked at the menu since the waitress walked away the second time. Her coat, expensive once, now looked borrowed from someone else's life, damp at the shoulders from a rain that had started an hour before and hadn't stopped since, and her hands, when she finally reached for the bread, were shaking in a way that had nothing to do with the cold. Ryan didn't ask why a grown woman was sitting alone in a diner on the wrong side of town with an empty wallet and eyes that kept sliding toward the door like she expected someone to recognize her. He just said, quiet, not quite looking at her, "You should eat something," and pushed the plate another inch closer. She froze with her fork halfway to the coleslaw, staring at him like he'd said something in a language she used to speak and had forgotten. Somewhere behind the counter, a plate shattered against the tile floor, and the whole diner turned to look. And in that half-second of noise and broken porcelain, Victoria Hayes understood, with a kind of clarity she hadn't felt in years, that the man across from her had no idea he was sharing his last $11 with the CEO of the company that employed 40,000 people just like him. To find out how a stolen wallet, a split sandwich, and one ordinary night ended up changing both of their lives completely, stay until the very end, because what happens after this dinner is not what either of them expected. If stories like this one, about people who get overlooked simply for being quiet, ever ring true for you, this is exactly the kind of thing this channel was built to tell. And so many of you watching have lived some version of it yourselves, whether it was at a job, in a family, or just walking through a world that rewards the loudest voice in the room. If that's you, we would love to hear it in the comments, because these stories only mean something when we get to hear yours too. And it's worth saying out loud, before we go any further, that a lot of people would say a company should never need a billionaire to put on second-hand shoes and wander into the rain just to find out how her own employees are actually living. That if the people at the top were doing their jobs, they'd already know. Others would say the opposite, that no spreadsheet or quarterly report could ever teach a person what one cold night on the street teaches in an hour, and that sometimes the only way to see clearly is to stop looking down from the top floor. 2 years earlier, none of this existed. Ryan Mitchell was still driving the same 15-year-old pickup with the ladder rack bolted to the bed, still waking at 5:30 to get Ethan ready for school before a full day of service calls. But back then, there had been a version of his life that looked entirely different, one where his name was on blueprints instead of invoices. Before his wife Laura got sick, Ryan Mitchell had run electrical crews on some of the largest commercial builds in the state. A master electrician who other contractors called when a job was too complicated for anyone else to touch. The kind of man project managers fought over because he never once needed a job explained to him twice. He had been for 11 years, one of 3 lead electricians subcontracted regularly by Hayes Industries on their commercial expansion projects, trusted with wiring data centers and manufacturing floors worth more than most people's houses. Then Laura got sick, slowly at first and then all at once, and Ryan had done what any father would do. He scaled everything down. He turned away the big commercial contracts that meant 12-hour days and out-of-state travel, and he built a small residential service business instead, 1 man and 1 van, so he could be home for chemotherapy appointments, and then, after she was gone, so he could be home for Ethan every single night without exception. Nobody at Hayes Industries remembered his name anymore. He had simply stopped showing up on job sites, and in a company that size, a subcontractor who stops showing up simply disappears from the paperwork, filed away as one more name in a database nobody bothers to open. By the time this story begins, Ethan was 9 years old, a serious, watchful boy who had inherited his father's habit of noticing things other people missed, and he was also, quietly, in the middle of a medical situation that was draining Ryan's modest savings faster than any electrician's income could replace them. A heart condition that required specialist visits, medication, and the looming possibility of a procedure that insurance would only partially cover. Ryan never mentioned the bills to anyone, not to his sister, not to his neighbors, not even to Ethan. who he protected from the numbers the same way he protected him from everything else that might make a 9-year-old feel like the world was unstable. He picked up every service call he could find, worked later than he should have, and told himself, the way tired fathers do, that it would sort itself out eventually. Across the city, in a glass tower that Ryan hadn't set foot inside in over 2 years, Victoria Hayes was fighting a different kind of exhaustion. At 38, she was the youngest CEO in her company's history, having inherited the position from her father, and then spent 6 relentless years proving to a skeptical board that she deserved it. Hayes Industries employed just over 40,000 people across manufacturing, logistics, and commercial construction divisions, and it was, at that exact moment, 3 weeks from finalizing a merger worth $2.4 billion, a deal that would double the company's footprint, and that the board had made unmistakably clear would define whether Victoria kept her seat at the head of that table. The pressure was constant, the kind that lived in her shoulders and her jaw, and the 3 hours of sleep she was getting most nights. And it was in the middle of that pressure that an anonymous internal employee survey crossed her desk. One line in it underlined by an assistant who thought she should see it. This company forgot what it's like to be one of us the day it started measuring us in headcount instead of names. Victoria read that line 11 times. She thought about her father, who used to know the names of foremen on every site personally, and she thought about how long it had been since she had spoken to anyone below the level of vice president without a meeting on the calendar first. She did not in that moment decide to go undercover as some kind of publicity exercise. She decided, quietly and without telling anyone, that she needed to remember what her own city looked like from the ground, just for one day, before she signed away a third of the company to people who had never once asked what the $12 an hour employees thought about anything. She told her assistant she had a personal appointment and would be unreachable, left her phone in the drawer of her desk, and changed into a plain gray coat and a pair of shoes she hadn't worn since business school, the kind of clothes that let a person disappear into a sidewalk crowd instead of standing out from it. She carried $80 in cash and a single subway card, no phone, no assistant, no security detail trailing 4 steps behind her for the first time in 6 years. For most of the afternoon it felt almost freeing, walking through neighborhoods she recognized only from aerial photographs in quarterly investor decks, watching people wait for buses that ran 15 minutes late, listening to 2 women outside a pharmacy discuss which generic medication was cheaper this month. Then, somewhere between a crowded transit platform and a flight of stairs, in the press of bodies during rush hour, someone's hand found the inside pocket of her coat, and by the time she noticed the weight was gone, her wallet, her cash, and her single subway card were gone with it, and she was standing in the rain with nothing, in a part of the city where nobody would recognize the name Hayes, even if she said it out loud. She walked for almost 2 hours after that, soaked through, telling herself she would find a payphone, a police station, something, but pride kept turning her feet in the wrong direction, because some distant, stubborn part of her did not want this night to end with her calling for a car and admitting the experiment had failed in under 6 hours. By the time she pushed open the door of a small diner glowing yellow against the wet, dark street, she was cold in a way she hadn't been cold since childhood, and hungry in a way she had genuinely never been hungry before in her adult life, and she sat down in a booth because her legs would not carry her any further, with no way to pay for anything on the menu. That was where Ryan Mitchell found her, 2 booths away, finishing a shift of service calls, with Ethan doing homework across from him, and 1 plate of food between them, because the account balance he'd checked that morning told him it needed to be 1 plate, instead of 2. He noticed her the way he noticed a flickering breaker or a hairline crack in drywall, a small wrongness other people's eyes slid past. The untouched water, the eyes on the door, the hands that wouldn't stay still. When the split sandwich happened, it happened the way it happens in the opening scene already described, and what followed was 3 hours neither of them expected. Ryan didn't ask questions that would embarrass her, and in exchange, Victoria didn't offer explanations that weren't true. She learned that Ethan liked dinosaurs and hated math homework in equal measure, that Ryan fixed things for a living and had once, a long time ago, built things instead, that despite exhaustion etched into every line of his face, He laughed easily and completely when his son said something funny, an unguarded, real sound she hadn't heard from a man in longer than she could remember. When the diner finally closed and Ryan offered to walk her partway toward wherever she was staying, since the streets weren't safe for a woman alone at that hour, she said something vague about a friend nearby and thanked him in a voice that cracked slightly on the last word. And then she watched him walk away holding his son's hand. And she stood on that corner for a long time afterward, in the rain, thinking about the 11 employees on his old subcontracting crew list she now vaguely remembered signing off on years ago, and about how completely she had lost track of a man like that. 3 weeks later, back in the tower, in a life that had resumed its usual gravity of board calls and merger clauses, an unrelated piece of paperwork crossed the desk of Nathaniel Cross, the company's polished, ambitious chief operating officer, a man who had spent a decade cultivating the exact kind of charm that made boardrooms trust him and made junior staff quietly afraid of him. Hayes Industries was accepting bids for a full electrical retrofit of its downtown data center ahead of the merger, a contract worth just under $600,000. And among the dozen submissions was a small, precise, technically flawless proposal from a one-man operation called Mitchell Electrical. Nathaniel didn't recognize the name, only the size of the outfit next to it. A single technician with no large crew and no corporate insurance rider beyond the state minimum. And in the interview room 3 days later, he made his opinion of that plain to Ryan's face. He said, in the smooth, reasonable tone of a man who had never once had to worry about how he'd pay for his own child's medication, that Hayes Industries could not stake a data center supporting 40,000 employees on a hobbyist with a van, that the proposal, however clean on paper, read like the work of someone who'd never handled anything at scale. And he said it in front of 2 other executives who nodded along. Without once looking at the technical drawings, Ryan had spent 11 unpaid hours preparing. Ryan didn't argue, he never did. He gathered his folder, thanked them for their time in a voice that gave away nothing, and walked out past a lobby with a company name on the wall he hadn't seen up close in over 2 years, without ever mentioning to a single person in that building that its CEO had eaten half of his dinner 3 weeks earlier. He drove home that night, Ethan asleep in the passenger seat with a dinosaur book open on his lap, and told himself, the way he'd told himself so many times before, that this was simply how it went for men like him, that dignity was the only thing left that nobody could disqualify him from. If any of you watching have ever sat in a room like that one, watching someone with less experience and more polish get chosen instead of you simply because you didn't look the part, we would genuinely love to hear about it in the comments. Because Ryan's story tonight belongs to every single person who has ever felt unseen in exactly that way. 3 weeks would pass in ordinary silence before a routine budget review would put Ryan Mitchell's name in front of the one person in that building who would recognize it instantly. Victoria hadn't stopped thinking about that diner. Not really. Not in the weeks since the merger negotiations swallowed her calendar whole again. She caught herself, in board meetings, watching the mouths of executives who talked about operational efficiencies and headcount optimization, and thinking of Ryan's hands, steady and unhurried, splitting a sandwich in half without a second thought for himself. She had told no one about that night, not even Priya Anand, her chief of staff and the only person in the building she genuinely trusted, though Priya had noticed the change in her anyway, a certain quietness that hadn't been there before, the way Victoria now asked, in nearly every meeting, whether a decision had actually been run past the people it affected or only past the people it would flatter. It was Priya who brought her the quarterly contractor review 3 weeks after the diner. A routine stack of approved and rejected vendor bids that would ordinarily never reach the CEO's desk at all. Except that Priya, methodical as always, had noticed something odd buried in the rejection notes for the data center retrofit. A technically superior bid, rejected not for cost or capability, but for a single handwritten note from Nathaniel Cross reading not the right profile for a project this size. A phrase with no engineering meaning whatsoever. Priya, who had learned over 4 years to trust her instincts about her boss's instincts, simply said, "You should probably look at this one yourself," and set the folder on Victoria's desk without further comment. The name on the folder was Mitchell Electrical. The address matched a neighborhood Victoria now recognized from a night she'd never told anyone about. She sat with that folder for 11 minutes without moving, and when she finally looked up, her first thought was not disbelief but something closer to shame, because she understood immediately what had happened. The man who had shared his last meal with a stranger, without knowing that stranger controlled his professional fate, had walked into her own building and been dismissed in a conference room by a man who worked for her, and she hadn't been there to stop it, hadn't even known his last name until that exact moment. She asked Priya to arrange a meeting, not through official channels, not through Nathaniel Cross's office, but a personal, direct call. And when Ryan picked up the phone 2 days later and heard the voice of the woman he'd known only as a stranger from a rainy diner, followed almost immediately by the voice of her assistant clarifying that this was, in fact, Victoria Hayes, Chief Executive Officer of Hayes Industries, there was a long silence on the line, the kind that carries an entire recalculation of a person's evening inside it. When they finally met, in a small coffee shop, Ryan chose deliberately, because it wasn't inside her tower, and he needed the ground to feel like his own. Victoria offered him what she assumed any reasonable person would want: immediate reinstatement of the data center contract at a premium rate, a formal apology on company letterhead, and a standing invitation to bid on every future Hayes Industries project without competitive review. Ryan listened to all of it without interrupting, and then he said, quietly, that he didn't want a contract handed to him because of who he'd once eaten dinner with, that if his bid was the best one, it should win on the numbers alone, the same way it should have 3 weeks earlier, and that what he actually wanted, if she was asking, was simply for someone in that building to look at proposals from small operators, the same way they looked at proposals from large ones, because he wasn't the only person in this city getting disqualified for the size of his van instead of the size of his skill. It was this insistence on earning rather than receiving, exactly the kind of quiet integrity that had unsettled Victoria 3 weeks earlier over a split sandwich, and it unsettled her again now, sitting across a much smaller table than her usual boardroom, watching a man turn down more money than most people would ever refuse. Their conversation, and the ones that followed it over the next several weeks, did not stay private for long. Nathaniel Cross, sensing correctly that his rejection of Ryan's bid was about to be quietly overturned, and sensing more dangerously that his CEO's sudden interest in a small-time electrician had a personal dimension he didn't fully understand but could certainly exploit, made a decision that would define the rest of this story. He leaked a distorted version of events to a business gossip columnist, framing it not as a story about a wrongly rejected contract, but as a scandal about a billionaire CEO secretly funneling company contracts to a man she was personally involved with. Evidence, he suggested off the record, of exactly the kind of favoritism the board should be worried about 3 weeks before a $2.4 billion merger vote. The story ran within days under a headline designed to wound rather than inform, and it followed Ryan home in a way that felt, to a man who had spent 2 years protecting his son from every possible instability, like watching a controlled fire jump a line he'd built specifically to contain it. Photographers waited outside his house. A reporter cornered Ethan's teacher outside the school gate. And this, more than any boardroom slight, was the moment that tested something in Ryan that had nothing to do with pride and everything to do with protection. Because it's worth asking honestly whether a man who stays quiet for years to shield his child, the way Ryan had, is protecting that child the right way, or whether silence like that eventually costs more than it saves. Reasonable people watching this story will land on different sides of that question, and there's no wrong answer, only the one each of us has actually lived. It would be another 6 weeks, through a scandal neither of them had chosen, and a storm neither of them saw coming in more ways than one, before the truth would finally outrun the version of it that Nathaniel Cross had set loose into the world. The storm that finally changed everything was, in the end, an actual storm, a late-season system that dropped 4 inches of rain on the city in 11 hours, and pushed the downtown data center's backup power system past every specification it had been designed for. At 2:40 in the morning, the primary transformer feeding the center's east wing failed, and with it went the redundant cooling system for a server floor that held, among other things, the financial records underpinning the merger vote scheduled for 6 days later. The retrofit contract, delayed for weeks by the scandal and by a board suddenly nervous about anything connected to Victoria's name, had never been fully completed, and the on-call electrical team, unfamiliar with a system installed by 3 different contractors over 3 different years, could not isolate the fault. Priya called Ryan directly at 3:15 in the morning, not through any official channel, simply because she had his number from the coffee shop meeting and because she knew, the way people who trust their instincts sometimes just know, that he was the only person who might actually understand a system nobody else in the building had ever fully documented. Ryan arrived within 40 minutes, left Ethan asleep at a neighbor's house with a note taped to the refrigerator, and walked into a server room full of panicked engineers standing around a schematic that was, he realized within 90 seconds, drawn incorrectly, missing an entire secondary bus line that had been added during a renovation years earlier, and never updated on the master diagram. He didn't ask for authorization. He didn't wait for Nathaniel Cross, who arrived 20 minutes later and immediately began questioning why an unauthorized contractor was standing inside a secure facility. Ryan simply traced the actual wiring by hand. Flashlight in his teeth, confirmed the fault was isolated to a single failed relay rather than the transformer itself, a distinction that meant the difference between a 2-hour repair and a total system replacement, costing the company an estimated $11 million in downtime during merger week. And he had the relay swapped and the cooling system stabilized by 5:50 in the morning, 40 minutes before the first executives arrived, for what would have otherwise been the worst morning briefing of Victoria Hayes' career. When she arrived at 6, still in the coat she'd thrown on after Priya's call had woken her, she found Ryan sitting on an overturned equipment crate, sleeves rolled up, quietly explaining to 2 very junior engineers exactly why the master schematic had been wrong for years and how to fix the documentation so this never happened again, refusing, when someone asked, to even discuss compensation for a job he technically hadn't been contracted to do that night. It was Nathaniel Cross, ironically, who forced the reveal that followed, because he made the mistake of trying to have Ryan escorted out of the building before the boarder arrived, loudly insisting in front of a dozen witnesses that this is the same contractor from that tabloid story, and I want him gone before anyone from the board sees him here. The room went still in exactly the way rooms do right before something breaks open. Victoria stepped between them and said, calmly enough that everyone in that server room would remember the exact words for years afterward, that yes, this was the same man from the story, that the story itself had been a deliberately distorted account fed to a reporter by someone standing in that room right now, and that the real story was considerably simpler. A company executive had disqualified the most qualified bid on a critical contract because he didn't like the size of the bidder's van, and had then tried to bury his own error under a scandal designed to destroy an innocent man's reputation rather than admit a mistake. She asked, in front of everyone, whether Nathaniel could produce a single technical justification for rejecting Ryan's original proposal, and when he could not, the silence in that room did more damage to him than any accusation could have. Word of what had happened in that server room reached the board by mid-morning, not through any press release, but through the 2 junior engineers Ryan had spent 20 minutes teaching, both of whom described what they'd witnessed with the plain astonishment of people who had just watched a genuine crisis handled by the one person nobody had wanted in the building 3 hours earlier. By that afternoon, Nathaniel Cross had been placed on administrative leave pending a formal review of the leaked story, and the falsified rejection notes Priya had already flagged weeks earlier, evidence that made his position, once the board actually looked at it, effectively impossible to defend. But Ryan, standing in a hallway outside the boardroom he'd once been dismissed in, felt none of the vindication he might have expected. He felt exhausted and quietly angry not at Nathaniel, but at the entire machinery that had let a lie about him travel further and faster than the truth ever could. And he felt something else too, watching Victoria defend him in front of her own board with a directness that had clearly cost her politically. Something that had nothing to do with contracts or vindication at all. Neither of them said anything about it there in that hallway. There wasn't time, and there wasn't the right kind of quiet. 1 month would pass through a formal review. a merger vote that ultimately succeeded despite the scandal rather than because of any cover-up, and a slow, careful rebuilding of trust between two people who had first found each other over half a sandwich in the rain, before either of them would finally say out loud what had been true since that very first night. The formal review concluded on a Tuesday, 4 weeks after the storm, in a boardroom packed tighter than any meeting Ryan had ever set foot in, though this time he wasn't there to be judged. Victoria had asked him to attend, and he had agreed only after she made clear it wasn't a ceremony built around him, but a genuine accounting the board owed to every contractor the company had quietly dismissed over the years the way Nathaniel Cross had dismissed him. In front of the full board, the two engineers who had watched him work that stormy morning, and Priya, who had assembled the paper trail piece by piece, Victoria laid out exactly what had happened. A technically superior bid rejected for no engineering reason, a fabricated media story designed to bury an executive's own mistake, and a company culture that had rewarded polish over competence for longer than anyone in that room wanted to admit out loud. She did not soften it for the board's comfort, even knowing that some of them still saw the merger's success as reason enough to let the whole matter quietly disappear. Nathaniel Cross's resignation was accepted that same afternoon, not as a punishment engineered by Victoria personally, but as the plain consequence of evidence that spoke for itself, once someone finally bothered to look at it. What followed in the days after was by design quieter than the story that had preceded it. Victoria offered Ryan the exact things a person in her position might be expected to offer: a permanent executive position overseeing facilities and vendor relations across the company, a public statement fully clearing his name in every outlet that had run the original story, a settlement figure large enough to erase every medical bill Ethan's condition had ever created, and several years' worth that hadn't happened yet. Ryan turned down the title without much hesitation, telling her plainly that a desk job in a glass tower wasn't who he was and never would be, and that he'd rather keep his hands on the actual work than manage other people's paperwork. He accepted the public correction, because Ethan deserved to walk through his own school without photographers waiting at the gate. But what he asked for instead of the money was something else entirely: a real standing bid process for small contractors across every Hayes Industries project, reviewed by an actual technical panel instead of a single executive's gut instinct, and a modest company fund to help cover medical costs for the children of subcontracted workers, the kind of workers who, like him, had spent years being erased from spreadsheets the moment their circumstances made them inconvenient to track. Victoria didn't just agree to it. She sat with him for 2 full afternoons, helping design exactly how it would work, something that felt, to both of them, considerably closer to what that first shared dinner had actually been about than any settlement check could have. The quiet coda to all of it came 3 months later, on an ordinary Thursday evening, back at the same diner where this entire story had started, a place Ryan had chosen deliberately and Victoria had agreed to without needing to be told why. Ethan sat between them working through a math worksheet he still hated, occasionally looking up to correct his father's spelling with the particular satisfaction of a 9-year-old who has just caught an adult in a mistake. There was a full plate in front of each of them this time, no dividing necessary, and at one point, watching Ethan explain a dinosaur fact to Victoria with the total seriousness only children bring to prehistoric reptiles, Ryan reached over and moved the small dish of coleslaw an inch closer to her side of the table, an unnecessary gesture that meant considerably more than it looked like it should. Victoria noticed it and said nothing and simply ate the coleslaw, and that was the entire scene. No music swelling, no crowd of onlookers. Just 3 people and 1 plate of food and a kind of quiet neither of them had known they were missing until they found it in exactly this booth. If there is one thing worth taking from Ryan Mitchell's story, it is this: the world is full of people quietly carrying more competence, more integrity, and more weight than anyone around them ever bothers to notice. People who get judged by the size of their van instead of the size of their skill, by their job title instead of the character it took to hold on to it through everything life put in front of them. Somewhere in your own life, right now, there is probably a person exactly like Ryan, someone who has been overlooked simply because they never learned how to make noise about their own worth. and it might be worth being the person who notices them, the way Ryan noticed a stranger who hadn't touched her water in 10 minutes. If you believe, the way this story insists, that quiet, overlooked people deserve to be truly seen, we would love for you to stay part of this story with us. Subscribing simply lets us know these are the kinds of stories worth telling more of, and there are so many more people like Ryan whose stories deserve exactly this kind of attention. Somewhere tonight, there's a plate being split in half between two people who have no idea yet what it's going to mean. And we hope you'll stay with us to find the next one.